Hello everybody! Today I'm starting a new series called Let's Make CRUD. Today I'm going to give you a little overview of what a CRUD application is and what are the basic components, and then I'm also going to do the first step, which is the database schema. Now first off, let's see what a CRUD is. A quick Google search will illustrate that it stands for create, read, update, and delete. Delete can also sometimes mean deactivate. So the first thing we're going to do is set up the database. This will allow us to read from the database, add to the database, and update the database, which is everything that we need for a CRUD. I'm going to use MySQL, and I'm going to follow these installation instructions for Windows because I'm using a Windows machine. So I'm just going to download the installer, and a few moments later. Okay, so I have the installer. I also installed the workbench so that I could actually interact with the database, and I'm going to go straight into the SQL here. It does give you some step-by-step for how to set up the workbench and the database itself in the instructions for the installer. So all of that is on the MySQL website. And I might switch between MySQL and MySQL, but trust me, it's MySQL. So I'm going to start off here by creating the pets table. Here I'll just create the ID, which is what will primarily identify each row of the pets table. I'll add the name, which is the description of the pet. I'll add the species. This can be cats, dogs, rabbits, fish, whatever. I'm also going to make this a table later to allow the user to select from a drop-down menu when that's all completed. I'll also add the age, and I'll just remind myself here with a comment that this will be in years. So if I have like 6 months, it will be 0.5 years. I'll add a description, which will just be some basic details about the pet. And I should also add the breed because there's a lot of different breeds between cats and dogs and even rabbits sometimes. And I'll just make this an integer as well so it can link to a breeds table. Alrighty then. I'll also add the sex of the pet, which will be male or female. And this I don't need another table for because it'll just be a single character. Next, I will add the size. This will be linking to another table to prevent dirty data. For example, somebody misspelling medium or spelling it with a capital M or a lowercase m. Another attribute that I'm adding to the pets table is the weight. This will be in pounds and will be a float so that you can have fraction of a pound. I'll also add a Boolean variable called fixed. This is whether or not the pet is spayed or neutered. This is pretty common on pet adoption websites as well. This can also be null if it doesn't apply to this particular pet. I'm also adding backticks here in case the name is already used in SQL. This means that name is supposed to be used only in certain circumstances, but here it indicates that this is in fact a column name, not the name in the general global space of MySQL. Something like that is in Python, where you have ID as a data type, and so is int and dict. That means you shouldn't name any of your variables that. In this case, I can still name them that without having any problems as long as I use the backtick. I'm also filling out more of the attributes of the pets, especially whether or not they're adopted. This is so that we can still have a record of the pets that have been adopted without having to delete this. I'm also adding a field called isActive to all of my tables, not just this one. You'll see later. This will indicate that the row itself has been deactivated in case it has links to other places, and we don't want to mess with the relationships in our database. Here I'm working on the species table, still has the ID, still has the name, and I'm also adding the isActive for that. That will allow us to do the same thing where we just remove it from use in the database without having to actually delete it. Later, I'm going to add a link between the species and the pets table, but before then, I'm going to fill out all of the other tables. So here I have the breeds. This will have an ID as well, a name, and a species ID so that we can have the user select the species and then give them an option of breeds for that species. And like the other tables, I'm adding a isActive column for soft deletes. I'm also going back and adding comments to remind myself what the certain columns mean. In this case, reminding myself that the isActive is for soft deleting the data instead of having to remove it from the database. Next up is the sizes table. I kind of waffled back and forth on how complicated I wanted to make the sizes table, maybe adding a minimum and maximum weight and a species so that it could basically provide a suggestion for what size of animal the pet is. In the end, I just went with simple ID, name, isActive, just like the species there. It was about this point where I realized that the pet should probably have a color associated with it so that users of the site can filter based on their color preference for different pets. So I went ahead and added the colors table here. It's going to be super simple still. ID, that's just going to be the primary key. Name, that's the color that it's going to be. And the isActive column. Then I went ahead and made a table that associates pets with colors. This way a pet could have multiple colors and a color could have multiple pets associated with it. This will have the ID, which is just the name of that the ID of that relationship. Then it will have the pet ID, which will come from the pet table, and it's going to be an integer here. And then it will have a color ID, which comes from the color table. And that way we could have multiple colors on the pets, and that could present itself as like brown / white / whatever. And I'm just giving myself a comment here just to remind myself what the heck this table does. And I'm also adding an isActive column there in case I want to do a soft delete there as well. After associating pets with colors, I realized that pets could have multiple breeds, like a dog could be a Great Pyrenees and a Labradoodle. Well, I guess a Labradoodle is a Labrador Poodle mix. But anyway, so I decided to make another relationship table like the pet color tags, and instead of linking pets with colors, linking pets with breeds. This way we could get all of those in there, assuming that we knew all the breeds of the pet. And like every other table in this schema, it's getting a isActive column for soft delete purposes. And now for a bit of cleanup, I'm going to add the tick marks to the table names just for consistency's sake. And I'm just going to do that for each and every one of them. And now for the fun part. We're going to link all of the columns that associate with tables that we've just designed them to associate with them. But we're actually going to put the relationships into the database. This will prevent dirty data from entering those columns. For example, if we only have 3 sizes, if it tries to put in a ID of 4 for the size, it's just going to say, hey, you can't do that, and kick back that error. I'm adding this for the pet's species ID, the pet's size ID, and the pet ID and color ID for the relationship between those two. and the pet ID and the breed ID for the relationship between those. I'm also going to add the relationship between the species ID and the breed in the breed table. I'm just making sure that all of those are in place. Okay, double checking. Looks good. Now for the actual fun part, we get to run the code and see if it works, which is always great. So I'm running the code and something went wrong here. Double checking where that was. It looks like I didn't actually have that database selected, so I'm trying again here. Just going to set that for the default as soon as I figure out what the problem is. Okay, now let's run that code again. It looks like I successfully created the pets table. Now let's see if I can get the rest of the tables in there. And I don't really want to run this one by one, so let's select that and see what happens. Alrighty. Okay. Looking good, looking good. Now I'm going to run the relationships. Okay, now let's double check those. And it looks like the colors table doesn't actually have any columns, which is a problem. So I'm going to try rerunning that code, and unfortunately, it can't be created again because it already exists in the database. And I can't delete it because it has a foreign key constraint with another table. So I'm going to try to figure out what's going on here, and I missed is active, so I added that back in. Still not working. Okay, I'm just going to try dropping the whole database and running all of the code again. I'm going to run the create code, then I'm going to comment it out and select that as my default, and look at the magic happen. And everything's there for the colors. Yeah! So now I am double checking that all of the columns showed up there, and it looks good. Alrighty, thank you for watching, and I hope you all have a wonderful next 2 weeks, because that's when I'm expecting to put out another video. The next one will be just the basic REST API to add and read data from this database that we just created. Hope you all do well. See you next time.